But death has become a terrifying concept, because I know there is nothing left for us on the other side.
Where to begin? Yes, I really am writing this from the year 2078. While time travel is a reality here, it is not in the form that your early 21st century science fiction movies would have you believe. There are no humans getting into machines and traveling back in time. No. It's only information that we can send back. This isn't even too outlandish even for all of you out there in 2017. If you look this information up on the internet, you'll see that scientists are already working on sending basic binary information through time. By 2078, this technology had already existed for almost 10 years, but is known only by a few and is heavily controlled. It was in the initial experimental stages when everything went to hell, and I am among the few who can even access it. How does it work? Well, there's no point in trying to even get into all that. Explaining it here would be like one of you trying to type out how a smartphone works to someone living in the year 1800. While experimentation has certainly occurred with the technology, no attempt has ever been made to try and actually alter the past. No one has any possible idea of what problems that would create. But, given the world I'm living in right now, I've eventually come to the decision that things can't possibly get any worse. 2071 is when things first begin to go poorly. But in order to help you understand, I suppose I should first give you a basic outline of what the world looked like at that time. People often have a romanticized version of the future. I'll point out that up until 2071 anyways, things were far more straightforward than you would suspect. I apologize to any international listeners for this America-centric version of history, but it's where I'm from and it's the little that I know of. In the time that I grew up, there was very little emphasis on the study of history. For summary's sake, I'm going to bullet point a few of these. 1. I had to research, but I did see that a businessman named Donald Trump is your current president. He's not a big name in history, and wasn't significant enough to be liked or hated in the long run. 2. There were a lot of media reforms in America in the early 2020s that led to a hard limit on profits for major news outlets, which in turn created far less polarizing clickbait media. This created a more educated and open-minded populace, which in turn led to many environmental reforms. 3. The 2040s is the first decade in a century where global temperatures and global population started dropping. The ice caps never melted. Weather patterns were never altered. 4. In regards to geopolitics, the United States was still the world's sole superpower in 2071. China was still close economically to America, but far behind militarily. Russia and its vast nuclear arsenal was still hanging around, as with Europe, albeit more fragmented. 5. Brazil and Argentina are fully developed economic powerhouses now. And last, India and Pakistan feuded in the 2030s, which escalated into nuclear war. It almost led to a global catastrophe, but its end result was a Pakistan almost wiped off the face of the earth, and an India in economic ruin. I think that's enough for now. I could go on about other changes, such as how augmented reality and beyond would alter the way you looked at entertainment. But that's not what this is about. This is about a warning. 2071. The year things went wrong. It started with a dramatic increase in mental illness, largely from the people who had previously shown no signs. No one knew at first what was going wrong, but it eventually was disclosed that they were cases of VCJD, or, in a terminology you'll be more familiar with, the human form of mad cow disease. This was actually caused from a late 2017 outbreak of the disease. Yep, you heard that right. In cows, which gets into pretty much every major beef provider. Being that the repercussions were so woefully misunderstood, a series of corporate cover-ups hid the truth from the general public. And before you knew it, approximately 30% of the beef in the world was contaminated far before recalls began. So that means that many of you out there were the ones who first contracted this disease. But it remained dormant in your body for over 50 years. Many of you will die during that 50-year incubation period, but you will have passed it on to your children and grandchildren. Nobody understood that this disease was lying dormant in our bodies for so long, being passed hereditarily. While there were a few sporadic and mild cases of the disease showing signs in humans in the decades that passed, it wasn't until 2071 that things took a turn. Mental illness cases began springing up by the millions. VCJD eats away at your brain, you see. The biggest effects were in the countries considered developed nations during the incubation period of late 2017, as they would have consumed the most beef. The streets started filling up with the mentally ill. People who had previously lived successful and productive lives were now aimlessly walking throughout the streets, muttering incoherencies. At the very beginning, there were facilities that could provide for sufferers of the disease, but within just a few months, space had worn thin. Things hit a critical mass when the percentage of the infected hit around 15%. There was simply nowhere for these people to go. Families who had no experience in dealing with mental illnesses were forced to try and cope with them. But as more and more of their families started showing symptoms, that quickly became impossible. When the percentage of the infected hit around 50%, society in general was starting to shut down. By 80%, America was pure bedlam. I should be clear in saying this is not a zombie type of story of the like that were popular on primetime television in 2017. The majority of the infected were not in any way violent, and most died within a few days of dehydration and starvation. They would just sit in the streets, sometimes mumbling incoherently, appearing in a state of perplexity. Some still had the sense to casually pillage the abandoned grocery stores for sustenance, while others just sat motionless until the elements took hold of them. Either way, they wouldn't respond to you if provoked. They were in a borderline vegetative state. But there were the small few who reacted far differently. I remember walking through the neighborhood and I saw a man screaming at the top of his lungs in the middle of the street. When I walked by him, we looked directly at each other. I can't quite shake how I felt when I saw the pain, confusion, and insanity in his eyes. He reached his hand and long fingernails up to his face and began ripping it apart. Blood dripped down what was left of his cheek as he licked the flesh and blood off his fingertips. He still screamed all the while. I was witnessing a man eating his own face. He was going in for round 2 when I looked away and hurried my pace. I saw another man who had somehow lost one of his arms. Had he ripped it off himself, perhaps? He was actually holding it with his other arm like a club, beating other infected with it as he walked by. When the man saw me, he screamed gibberish at me and limped after me for a while, holding his severed limb in his hand like a baseball bat. And the infected children, they were the most unbearable. Deep down inside, they knew something was terribly wrong, and they still had the instinct to cry. They somehow found each other and huddled among one another, wailing together in madness. You have to understand that I wanted to help them, more than anything. But for a short time, there were thousands of them in the major city centers. I watched as a partially infected man stumbled towards a group of crying children near one of the major city bridges. He was yelling, "Shut up!" between outbreaks of hysterical laughter and screaming. He was picking up the crying children one at a time and hurling them off the bridge. He would laugh and slap at his head with both hands as he watched the children fall to their deaths. Was there still a sane part of him left that was trying to put these children out of their misery? Or was there no semblance of logic to such madness? There are so many more details that I'd like to include, but this already has gotten rather lengthy. The long story short is that the American government, I can't really speak for what is happening in other nations, didn't just completely buckle and collapse. It started gathering survivors and began moving them into a few key cities in an attempt to re-establish order. These people were largely the descendants of those who didn't eat beef in 2017, as well as a very small percentage of people who, for whatever reason, seemed immune to the disease. After a few years, it looked as though things might even fully recover. There were still approximately 20 million survivors in the United States alone. There were hardly any infected still alive at that time. Things